How good is the Leica SL2 with autofocus tracking? Let's find out in this video, where I will explain all the settings in the camera menu and do a test shooting and try out autofocus tracking on the new Leica SL2. Let's get started. So let's talk about focus tracking now, and let's look into the menu and how to set this up. First of all, you see here I'm currently in manual shooting mode. You can also go to aperture priority. On sports, it might be particularly helpful to go to shutter priority. If you want to freeze movements, you might want to do this at 1/1000th of a second, for instance. What is recommended in any case is to let the ISO float freely, and I typically go to auto ISO here because I think that helps me to adjust light. And since this camera here, the Leica SL2, is very capable of shooting with higher ISO values, there is no harm in setting an upper stop for the ISO, for instance 1600 or 3200, and letting the ISO being adjusted by the camera itself. Then the next thing you want to consider here is, if you go into the menu, if you use burst mode with high speed, then having JPEG and DNG here, so digital negative, RAW and JPEG at the same time, can be a bit tricky from a buffering perspective. So if you don't necessarily need the RAW file here, you can also go to JPEG only, and that will give you more buffer capacity if you do continuous shooting with a high burst rate. Then the next thing you want to do here is, if you go to drive mode, you have continuous low speed, continuous medium, high speed and very high speed, and you should choose one of those because that gives you the right autofocus mode here. So if you are on the drive mode, make sure you have continuous or burst mode here. Autofocus single is not what you want to have for a sport shooting. Take autofocus continuous, because then the autofocus will adjust itself and it will also get sticky on the target you have. We come to that in a moment. There is also the option here to go intelligence autofocus. And that's something I personally never use, because then the camera basically decides what should be in focus and what not. And I don't want to have that. I want to decide this myself and want to make sure I have control over focus. So autofocus continuous here is the right option for you. Coming to the focus options, you again hit the menu button, you come to the quick menu, and then you can toggle here between different options. So what I use very often is field, and I also use spot if I want to focus at a really small area on my subject. What I also use for that shooting I'm going to show samples of later is face and body detection. And that actually works pretty well. I was surprised how well the Leica SL2 was catching focus and keeping focus, even if the subject is moving quickly and erratically. So that is something which is helpful. You also have here general tracking. Then it not necessarily has to be a human being or an animal or a face, what have you. And you also have here, of course, zone focusing, field we covered, spot we covered, and multi-field. And multi-field is the one I recommend the least, because again, the camera is deciding for you what it's doing, which is not what I want. For the shooting where I would show samples, I used face and body detection, and that actually worked very, very well for me. You have predefined autofocus settings here when it comes to sensitivity and updating autofocus, and that's on the next menu. So if you go to autofocus here and you push the joystick, you can choose between children and pets, which are probably supposed to be a bit more erratic. You have team sports here, you have a runner, wildlife, and so on. So there are different things, and you can also customize these settings. So for instance, the depth sensitivity, which means 3D tracking, field movement, and shift in direction, which has different options. So if we would go here to team sports, you see this is going into the depth sensitivity 1 notch lower, but field movement 1 up and shift in direction even 2 up. And you can customize them, you can store them in the way you want. And it takes a little bit of experimenting what is the right setting for a particular situation where you want to shoot. I was here in children pets and I left it at that way, and it worked pretty well for me, but different situations require different settings here. And I would invite you to experiment yourself, maybe share your experience and how this tweaking was helping you in getting focus, catching focus, keeping focus on moving objects. And then the last thing you might want to do here is on the menu, if you go to metering, I think if you have difficult light conditions, spot metering is very helpful typically because it gets the brightness where it should sit, but it can also overexpose the background, of course. And a good compromise is to go to center weighted. And if you think the camera should decide based on a matrix, then multi-field is the right setting here. One additional remark, if you want to use the buffer capacity in continuous shooting, so remember we've been here in autofocus continuous and in burst mode at high speed, you also need a high speed SD card, and that is very important. So you see your SD card in the menu basically here, you can format the card and so on. But if you don't have a high-speed SD card, buffering and writing the images, in particular if you do both RAW and JPEG, onto the SD card can be slowed down significantly if you don't have a high enough transfer rate from the camera onto the SD card. So make sure you don't buy the cheapest one out there in the market if you want to go for sports and action tracking, because then it will not work. And as I said, take into account my little tip from the beginning. If you don't urgently need RAW, go for JPEG only. And there might even be a compromise for some in sports photography where you go to the JPEG menu and basically say here, so let's go to JPEG settings, where you go not for large, but you might want to go for 24 megapixels because that still gives you sufficient resolution in sports photography. You don't need the full 47 megapixels typically, and that will significantly increase the speed how these images are written onto the SD card, and speed up the whole process and give you more buffer capacity in your shooting. The next shooting situation was much more tricky and difficult. So here I was on a Spanish island with my Leica SL2 in the city, and on this crossway there was a guy doing stunts on a unicycle, and I was a little bit disappointed that no one paid attention to him. So here's the guy. He was a funny guy. He was actually very athletic and did nice tricks with his unicycle. So I got in touch with him and said, what about if I can test my autofocus here and do a shooting of you? And in exchange, of course, I offered him a few bucks because I think it's a shame if someone is trying to making money, sweating, investing energy and effort, and no one is paying attention. So we agreed in the shooting, and I can tell you he really made a lot of effort, and I got a unique opportunity to test the Leica SL2 with the APO-SUMMICRON 50mm in a shooting situation where the moves were unpredictable. So this was kind of an erratic movement forth and back in a three-dimensional situation, and I was quite surprised how well the Leica SL2 kept pace with the guy's art and took the shots. So let's have a look what the result of this shooting was and how the images look like. I should say I met him later again when I was doing street photography in that city, and we had another nice conversation. Really good guy. So my conclusion is simple. The Leica SL2 with the APO-SUMMICRON 50mm is also fantastic, besides many other things I pointed out on my channel, when it comes to focus tracking. And that lens actually is advertised from Leica as being very quick and especially spot on in autofocus, and I can fully confirm that. If you liked my video, please give me a thumbs up. If you like my channel, please subscribe. Thanks for watching and peace out.